The architecture of a family. Jonathan Hale had always believed that families were simple structures. Parents raised children, children grew up, and the cycle repeated across generations. Yet one quiet Sunday afternoon would challenge that assumption in ways he never anticipated. While reorganizing an old desk that had belonged to his grandfather, Jonathan discovered a sealed envelope hidden beneath a stack of faded documents. The handwriting on the front looked deliberate and patient, as though the writer had chosen every letter carefully. The message written on the envelope was short but strangely personal. It read, "To my family, when the time feels right." Jonathan immediately recognized the handwriting as that of his grandfather, Edward Hale. Edward had died nearly 15 years earlier, leaving behind a legacy of quiet wisdom. He had never been a man who spoke loudly or frequently, but when he did speak, everyone in the room listened attentively. Jonathan opened the envelope slowly, almost ceremonially. Inside he found several pages of neatly written text that appeared to tell a story about the Hale family and its long history. The letter began with an observation that captured Jonathan's full attention. Edward wrote that a family was not merely a collection of relatives but rather a complex architecture built from invisible emotional threads. Jonathan paused for a moment, reflecting on the metaphor. As a historian, he had spent years studying political movements, wars, and social transformations, yet he had rarely considered the intricate design of his own family. Edward continued by explaining that families function less like trees and more like webs. Every individual shapes the others, often in subtle ways that become visible only after many years have passed. A compassionate grandmother might inspire kindness across generations. A stubborn uncle might encourage independence in younger relatives who learn to challenge authority. Edward then began describing Jonathan's great-grandparents, Samuel and Margaret Hale. They had immigrated from England at the beginning of the 20th century with little money but an extraordinary determination to build a stable life. Samuel worked relentlessly to provide financial security for the household. Margaret, meanwhile, served as the emotional center of the family, offering patience and guidance to every child who needed reassurance. Edward wrote that their partnership had shaped the character of the entire family. Their resilience created a culture of perseverance that later generations unknowingly inherited. The letter then shifted toward Edward's own childhood experiences. He had grown up with 3 siblings whose personalities differed dramatically from one another. Robert, the eldest brother, carried a constant sense of responsibility. He believed it was his duty to protect the younger siblings and ensure that the family maintained its dignity. Eliza, the only sister, was fiercely independent and intellectually curious. She often questioned family traditions, insisting that customs should evolve rather than remain permanently fixed. Thomas, the youngest sibling, possessed an extraordinary sense of humor. According to Edward, Thomas could dissolve almost any family argument with a perfectly timed joke. Edward reflected that siblings are often a person's first companions in life. At the same time, they are also the first rivals, critics, and allies a person will ever encounter. Jonathan found himself thinking about his own younger sister, Clara. During childhood they had competed constantly in school, each determined to prove intellectual superiority. Despite their rivalry, they remained deeply loyal during difficult moments. Whenever one of them faced uncertainty, the other instinctively offered support without hesitation. Edward then discussed the relationship between generations within a family. He observed that each generation tends to believe it understands the world better than the one before it. Yet people rarely realize how much emotional inheritance they carry from their parents and grandparents. Values, fears, ambitions, and expectations often travel silently across generations. Children often believe they are inventing themselves independently. In reality, they are continuing conversations that began long before they were born. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, contemplating this idea carefully. Many of his professional ambitions, he realized, mirrored the intellectual curiosity that his mother had always encouraged. At the same time, his desire for stability reflected his father's cautious personality. Without realizing it, Jonathan had absorbed traits from both parents. Edward also acknowledged that not every family relationship remains harmonious. Over time, disagreements and misunderstandings sometimes create emotional distance between relatives. One distant cousin had stopped attending family gatherings after a dispute regarding inheritance. The argument had lasted years and eventually transformed into silence. Edward refused to condemn the cousin for his absence. Instead, he wrote that distance does not always destroy a family but sometimes rearranges the space between its members. Jonathan appreciated this balanced perspective. Families, he realized, were rarely either perfectly harmonious or permanently fractured. They existed somewhere between affection and conflict. Love, rivalry, forgiveness, and misunderstanding often coexisted within the same relationships. As the letter approached its final pages, Edward began discussing the importance of memory. According to him, memory forms the true foundation of any family. Photographs, traditions, stories, and shared experiences gradually form a collective identity. Without those memories, relatives become little more than strangers sharing the same surname. Jonathan suddenly felt a quiet sense of urgency while reading those words. Many of the stories told by his grandparents had already faded from everyday conversation. Younger relatives rarely asked about the past anymore. Family gatherings had become shorter, quieter, and less focused on storytelling. Edward appeared to have anticipated this possibility years earlier. His final message addressed the responsibility of future generations. He wrote that the past survives only when someone chooses to carry it forward. Without deliberate effort, family history slowly dissolves into silence. Jonathan folded the letter carefully and placed it back on the desk. For several minutes he sat quietly, absorbing the weight of his grandfather's words. Finally he stood up and walked toward his bookshelf. After searching for a moment, he found an empty notebook waiting to be used. At the top of the first page he wrote a simple title, The Hale Family Archive. Then he began recording every memory he could recall about his relatives. He wrote about childhood holidays, conversations with grandparents, and the strange habits of certain uncles. Each memory felt like a small thread connecting the present to the past. As Jonathan continued writing, he realized something profound about families. They are not preserved automatically through time. Families survive because someone decides to remember. And now, that quiet responsibility had passed to him.